C&D. I'm Adam Oslin. We got Chuck Mockler on with us, Will Updike, and a special guest we'll get to in just a moment. Coming up on today's show, yes, we'll talk about the Marcus Morris social media post, talking about Clippers fans. We'll also get into more of what Coach Lou said on the Up in Smoke or All the Smoke podcast with
Adam.
Steven Jackson, who I do own a jersey of, the Pacers one. Because I was a degenerate back in the day, and I thought it was cool that he hit that fan. It's not cool, guys. It's really not cool.
But we'll save that for another episode.
Some gray area. Either way, we got Joey Lynn, who is a hit with Clipper Nation. We all love him. He is at Joey Lynn, 2 N's with an underscore at the end on Twitter. He writes for SI Now. He also works for the Sporting Tribune. He has the Clips Convo podcast, and he is one of the most articulate, well-spoken members of the media, not just with the Clippers, just universally accepted that way throughout the media in the sporting universe. Joey, thanks for joining us here on C&D. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm doing even better after that intro. I appreciate the love.
I should also say he's a member of the Eagles, the Biola Eagles, that is. Biola University, I went there as well. So
what division do they play in?
Hey, they're D2 now. You know what's funny? That's actually kind of how I got my start in all this. They were NAIA. No, they might have even NAIA. I don't know. When I first got into Biola, they weren't NCAA like D2 at all, but that's how I kind of got my start. Was once they got bumped up to D2, their broadcast expanded, and they actually had like a live stream and all that. And that's how I got play-by-play reps. So it worked out nice for me. So, yeah, put some respect on the Eagles. A little D2 action now.
Yeah, hey, man. That's almost D1. That's good.
Joey, let's put some respect in your reporting skills. You had the post or the tweet that rocked Clipper Nation a little bit. I guess it wasn't that unexpected, but it confirmed what some people were hoping it would, which is that James Harden, part of the interest of him coming to the Clippers is because he wants to reunite with Russell Westbrook. Just talk about their relationship a little bit going back to the Rockets days.
Yeah, so listen, I don't ever pretend to know more than I do. I'm obviously only a year into this whole reporting thing. Obviously, you guys know I've been grinding towards this for several seasons, but in terms of doing this, actually as a job, I've only been in the business for one full season now. So I don't pretend, like I said, to know more than I do when it comes to scoops and things like that. That report wasn't that massive. It wasn't anything that I don't think can be really deduced from people who are just kind of paying attention. But I did want to put it out because I had seen a lot of people kind of mention that, like, wait, are Russ and James cool? Like, I know their time in Houston was a little bit weird. There were some reports during their time in Houston that Russ wasn't completely happy with the way that James goes about his business. Russ actually came out at the time that report was published and kind of shut it down on Instagram. So like I said, it wasn't that big of a breaking news piece from me to say that, but I did want to put it out because I think there's some people who may have missed some of those things, which is why I said it. And I've been talking to a lot of people throughout the course of the summer. I've been going to a lot of different things, and I'm probably hearing a lot of the same things that everybody else is hearing. But as it pertains to that particular report, I can say with pretty strong confidence that those two guys are on good terms. They do have a positive relationship. And I actually have been hearing that for a while before I put it out, before even Russ actually re-signed, that part of the reason why James had the Clippers on his radar was because he wanted to play with Russ again. So it was more so just a little extra piece of the puzzle. It didn't change a whole lot, but it was something that I felt was worth putting out because, like I said, some people didn't really know or weren't 100% sure that those two guys were on good terms.
So there's obviously no issue going back to the Rockets days, but in speaking to James Harden and his interest, and it seems like he's adamant about coming to the Clippers, is there anything else you'd like to break on C&D with what you can say is
Adam didn't clear this with us, Adam or Joey, so he's just going rogue right
interview.
now.
Well, listen, this is what me and Adam do. Like, even when I go on the Clips Talk show, we don't talk about any of the questions beforehand. We just go, man. So this is nothing new for me. But yeah, to answer your question, in terms of things that you guys don't already know, there's nothing I can tell you on that front. But I think it's pretty obvious to those who've been paying attention what's going on here, right? The Philadelphia 76ers want to continue to keep their championship window open, which is what they should do with a player like Joel Embiid. So they're not interested in Marcus Morris, Robert Covington, Nicholas Batum.
It works on the trade machine, deals. Man. They just got to accept it.
Right? It does, So people kind of need to understand that, just because these or the expiring contract that the Clippers can be offering, and they make the money work. And even with the lack of interest that reportedly does, kind of exist around the league when it comes to Harden, Philadelphia is not just going to take an offer like that from the Clippers because they aren't in a situation to do that. They got to keep Embiid happy. They have to keep their championship window open. So this is not a rebuilding team that could just take on expiring money and say, you know what, we'll just look towards the future. So because of that, that's why you're kind of seeing a lack of movement on that front in terms of Harden. So that's not all that hard to figure out, but that's really what's happening right now. And for the Clippers on their side, they recognize that, hey, look, there isn't a strong market for James Harden right now, primarily because he can become a free agent at the end of next season. You don't want to give up a whole lot for a guy who, one, doesn't want to be there, and two, can actually leave at the end of next season. It's not like Damian Lillard or KD from a year ago where, maybe he doesn't want to be there, but he's under contract for 4 years. So, you can actually keep him around. It's a different situation. So the Clippers recognize that there's a lack of interest around the league. So they're not just going to give Philadelphia everything that they want right now. Even if it does, in years past, comparing it to SAR packages that are usually sent out doesn't really line up, even if you do include a guy like Mann or some of these other pieces that the Clippers will want to hold on to. So that's where we find ourselves right now. Philadelphia wants what they want. The Clippers don't want to give that up. And the Clippers feel that as we get closer and closer to training camp, Philadelphia is going to have to make a decision. Do we want to accept what's on the table right now, or do we want to bring a potentially disgruntled and unhappy James Harden into training camp and then cause potentially problems there starting the season? So that's where we're at right now. Again, yes, that's from what I've heard, but it's also not all that hard to figure out when you just look at where things are right now. But yeah, that's my understanding of what's happening.
Do you think it might turn into a staring contest between like the 76ers and the Clippers about like how close it gets to training camp? Because I think most of us are like, it would be nice if the Clippers could get this done early so everyone could kind of gel and whatnot. So I'm wondering if that might come into play. And it just feels like such a seesaw at that point.
I actually just mentioned that on one of my last podcast episodes, where this is a situation where the Clippers obviously recognize that they're not bidding against very much right now. But at the same time, the longer you let this go on, I think there's a few risks that you run. And one of them is what you just brought up. Some of the others are, I guess, in theory, it would give Philly more time to maybe mend things with him and sell him on the possibility of coming back. I don't think that's all that big of a risk based upon what we're seeing reported right now. He doesn't want to be there. So that is something to consider. And then also, too, it gives other teams the opportunity to maybe think, hey, James Harden might be an option for us, like a team like the Knicks or some of these other teams that have been kind of like floated around as potential options for him. So I don't see those as major risks. But the point that you just brought up was actually what I said on my last podcast, I think is the major risk for the Clippers right now. The longer they let this go on, you want to try to get him in as early as possible because, listen, we have seen this team have to take a little bit to figure things out, right? Like they've had some pretty significant changes during this Kawhi and PG era, and it hasn't necessarily been a thing that they figure out right away, especially when you consider the fact that like guys are in and out of the lineup. All of a sudden now we're in, let's say February, and we're, putting out those tweets like, oh, the Clippers are 2-0 this year when fully healthy. It's like, you know what I mean? Like you want to try to get your full complete roster together as early as possible to give them an opportunity to work things out. So I do think that that's one of the factors at play here is, one, Philadelphia doesn't want to run the risk of bringing a disgruntled James Harden into camp. But at the same time, the Clippers don't want to run the risk of having to enter camp with potentially a group of guys that are going to have to be sent out, and also without a guy who projects to be, a star and a starter level player on your team. So, yeah, that's definitely a factor at play in all this.
Do you think if Terrence Mann was included today, the deal would be done with Philly?
I do. Yeah, I definitely do. I think the Clippers know that as well because, again, you look around the league and this, again, partially what's already out there as well. There isn't a whole lot on the table being offered to the 76ers right now for James Harden. Right. There's just not. So you look at a guy like Terrence Mann, who, again, I don't like calling him a young player because he's really not. Like a lot of people call him that, but it's not really what Philadelphia needs. They need a player who can help them win right now. They don't need a young player. They need a good player. And Terrence Mann is a good player. Is he the type of player that would normally be included as like the key to a star level package? Probably not. But in the context that we're working within right now, yeah, I believe that that's probably the best player that Philly could potentially be able to get. So if the Clippers were to offer him, I think that we would be able to have a deal right now. But I think the fact that the Clippers haven't offered them speaks to the confidence that they have in the lack of bidding war that exists right now.
Let's play the hypothetical scenario forward a little bit. Should James Harden become a Clipper, how much do you like the fit? Where do you think there could be some drawbacks or some negatives?
Yeah, so I went back and forth on this on my last podcast episode, and what I ultimately landed on was yes, I do think that this is a move that they should make. And the reason why I landed on that is because you look at where we are in the 2-1-3 timeline right now. It's at the point where I think you're too far past the point of let's be conservative now, right? With just where Kawhi and PG are contractually, where your role players are just in terms of their overall, productivity. So I think you're past the point of thinking, wait, you know what? Let's hold on. Let's not make a splash like this. I think they're too late in the game to do that. They have to make a play to be able to elevate their chances of winning a championship, and I think they need to do it this summer. Could the Clippers, as currently constructed, compete? Maybe. I kind of lean towards no, just because of the health issues that we've seen. I just don't think if this were 2K and you could turn injuries off and you look at the roster that they have, I think you could say yes, maybe this team has a shot. But I mean, how realistically, can we say that, right? We've seen this now 5 years in a row, essentially, where these guys are going to miss time, and not only does that become an issue if they're unavailable in the playoffs, but even before then, like your seeding is something that you have to consider. Like all of this is something that needs to be considered. So because of that, I do think just in a vacuum, a player like Harden is going to be the type of piece that can take you from maybe a team that's like really trying to bank on some luck in order to get into the championship mix to like, if things go right, you should be in the mix type situation. So that's kind of where I land on that in a broad sense.
You spoke a little bit about his relationship with Russ, and it's good off the court. On the court, how do you see those two working? Would they both be in the starting lineup, you think, game one, if that was the roster?
If I had to guess, I would say yes, but I think it's a hard thing to say definitively. I think that's also part of the reason why you would want to get him in for training camp, right? Because you want to look at these types of things. I mean, last year the Clippers entered training camp not knowing who their starting point guard was going to be, and they allowed camp to kind of make that decision for them. So it's hard to say that definitively right now, but I do want to bring up one point that I've seen kind of get floated around when you talk about the potential starting lineup of Russ and Harden together, is that it slides Kawhi and PG up from the PG from the 2 to the 3 and then Kawhi from the 3 to the 4. And there's some people who have concerns about that. I have less concerns about that because I think if you look at the NBA and where it is right now, yes, there are some physical fours around the league, but it's a lot different from how it used to be, even when we were all younger and starting to watch basketball. And you have Blake playing the 4 and DJ playing the 5, and like Zach Randolph playing the 4 and Marc Gasol playing the 5, or Bynum and Gasol. Like you look around the league, even just a decade ago, and you see a lot of teams playing two traditional bigs. It's very rare to see that now. Like, yes, there are guys like Aaron Gordon who's more physical as a 4, Zion, AD if they play him there, Jaren Jackson if they play him there, and like those are some things that you would maybe have to switch your matchup for. But just on a league-wide sense, I actually think you can make the argument that it would be better for Kawhi and PG to not have to slide with some of these smaller guards and some of these more shifty players and actually play up a position than it would be to keep them where they're at right now. So I don't think that's as big of a concern when you're just talking about potentially having to slide those guys up a spot to get Harden in the starting lineup. I do understand where people are coming from, but I just don't think it's as big of an issue where you can say, well, we can't play this lineup because Kawhi can't play the 4 and PG can't play the 3.
One of the reasons I think it would be important for them to get James Harden is because while he may start in game one, and that may be your backcourt with him and Russell Westbrook, and they played together before, and Russ had two of the best months of his career when the Rockets went 5 out. But I think it gives you a better opportunity to bring Russ off the bench. I know you're a big fan of Russell Westbrook. You put up some audio recently from Podcast P and Terrence Mann talking about what a great mentor he is. But he obviously can be a polarizing player in the fan base as well. Just how do you think that fit would be? Would he be better suited just coming off the bench and running that second unit with Harden being the starting point guard?
So I think part of what acquiring Harden allows you to do as well is that if Russ felt more comfortable in the starting lineup, or if Harden felt more comfortable running with those guys, even if you wanted to start them all together, you still have the opportunity to bring one out at the 6 minute mark and then bring them back in with the second unit. So I don't think it's as big of a deal who starts with which group as opposed to who gets the majority of the run with which group. And I think when you're looking at what the Clippers' potential roster construction could be, you can make the argument that Russ's skill set would be better off next to some of the guys that are going to be in the second unit. Again, we don't know 100% who that's going to be at this point. It could change a lot between now and the start of the regular season, but his downhill ability, playing with a big like Mason who can finish, playing with maybe a guy like Norm. Again, we don't really know what's going on with that situation, but a guy who's a great catch and shoot guy in Norm, you would want to try to maximize that a little bit. But if you wanted to still start Russ, I think you could do that and just bring him back in with that group. And the addition of Harden, I think, allows you to do that even more so because you're keeping a primary high-level ball handler on the floor at all times with Kawhi and PG. That way, you can keep one or both of them on the court with Kawhi and PG at all times. I think that would be a positive thing.
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like people point to the defensive rating, which is really good with Russ on the floor with Kawhi and PG. The offensive rating is a little low compared to what I think, a championship type team like we were just talking about kind of is. How does Harden fit into that? And kind of just a totally separate thing. I think if we could keep Terrence and get Russ on the bench somehow with Harden, that would be a really fun pairing. Just kind of with KJ Martin and stuff like that. But where do you sit kind of on the offensive fit with Russ and Kawhi and PG? Is it just more time or what? Because more time is kind of always the answer with the Clippers stuff. But other than time, what do you think it is?
Which is why we want him in at training camp, right? That's what everyone's Harden now.
Absolutely. Well, I looked at those numbers as well because when I was writing my piece about why I thought the Clippers should bring Russ back, I was looking at a lot of those numbers. And obviously, like you said, the defense looked good. The offensive rating was low. But I think, too, one of the things that you have to consider, and Man brought this up on a podcast episode, was that the Clippers' first 5 games, that 5-game losing streak when everybody was freaking out when they first added Russ, I think 4 of those games came without Zoo.
Yeah.
And it bumped Mason into the starting lineup, which was just not a good fit. And it also just bumped.
Some people had to take back some things they said about Mason Plumlee's ability on this team when we saw him starting.
Well, what's funny? This is a complete side point. I'm not going to go too far off on a tangent, but I swear, like anytime a center not named Zoo does something positive on this team, there's some people on Clippers Twitter who are like, get Zoo out of here. This guy's better. Like we've seen it with almost every single big the Clippers have had. That's a completely separate point, but I know what you're saying. So during that 5-game stretch, I think you can't take a whole lot away from the overall sample size that we saw per 100 possessions wise when you're looking at Russ's entire tenure with the Clippers, because there just wasn't, and it plays into your answer of more time, there just wasn't enough time with him next to the best version of the Clippers. And you got to remember too, like, there was still the Marcus Morris situation was still going on at that time. Like he was still pretty much cemented into the starting lineup. So it's like if you maximize the best
with Marcus,
right? The Denver game was when it kind of really, everybody realized like this is becoming an issue. So I think you could look at those numbers and you could see some good things. You could look at those numbers, you could see some bad things. But I want to get back to the point I was making about Terrence. He brought that up, that when you're looking at those first 5 games specifically, the Clippers were not only playing without Zoo, but they were also playing some really good teams. So it's like they were playing, Denver. They were playing I think Kings twice. So like they were playing some good teams as well. So I'm pretty optimistic just based upon what I've seen, what the guys have said about how they feel comfort wise, that the fit could work offensively. I definitely acknowledge the numbers that say it wasn't where it probably should have been, like you said, for a championship caliber team. But I also think there's some context as well when you just talk about who was in the lineup, who wasn't in the lineup, who they were playing, a lot of that. You get these guys together for a full training camp, and you have some reason to believe that it could work out, because we also saw the Clippers, as flawed as Ty Lue was last year, I think you saw him get pretty creative with his deployment of Russ offensively. Yeah. So I think you have some reason for optimism there as well. Like it's not going to be a situation with the Lakers where it's like you saw him standing in the corner a lot with the Lakers, and that's just not, I don't think, the best use for him. Even if you do want to get him off the ball and get the ball in the hands of Kawhi and PG, there's better ways to do that. And I think the Clippers were kind of starting to figure that out last year, and hopefully with the full training camp and a full season, Lord willing, they can get that going.
Do you think Russ is still that guy that can bring the best out of Paul George? Because he did have his best season statistically with him.
I mean, PG says so. So I think you kind of just got to rock with that. As you know, polarizing as that topic can be, where you can argue whether or not you think that should be the case, right? Like, should Paul George need a player like Russell Westbrook to bring the best out of him? You know, you can argue that all day long. But if that's the case, then, you know, I think that it can be a positive thing. So all we can go is based upon what PG has said, what Kawhi has said. Obviously, Kawhi is not as vocal, but he was consistent in his comments about how he felt Russ made him better, made the rest of the guys better. And I think, too, the point that I keep bringing up, and this is something that you're never going to see on, you know, NBA.com, you know, looking at stats. But and again, this is nothing against people. I do that all day long, so I'm not taking a shot at
box score, Joey.
Right. Yeah, I try to leave room for both. So
Bio nerds.
What I was gonna say is that I just think the overall belief and just the overall level of intensity and just focus that Russ demands of his teammates is going to be good for this team. Because anybody who's watched this team really throughout the entirety of the Kawhi and PG era, but definitely last year, there was just a lack of urgency that persisted far too often, where you just feel like, how badly do they want it? And I think that's a combination of, one, just an aging roster that can probably be both, one, fatigued and or injured, but also, two, I do think there was just a lack of urgency that set in at times. And that's just something that Russ doesn't allow for. And it's in practice, he approaches it the same way. In games, he approaches it the same way. So I think that just that overall mentality, having him in the mix from day one, is going to be good for everybody from Ty Lue on down to the rookies. So looking forward to that for sure.
That's a good call. We got to take a quick break because we do have to pay some of the podcast bills. But coming up, we're going to talk the contract extension stuff that was kind of floating around today on Clippers Twitter. Kind of what you alluded to earlier too, as well as how they can take the season more seriously. But first, there's ads. If they've been loud for you, go ahead and turn it down. Some people have complained about that. We got ads in 3, 2, 1.
All right, so we're back here on Clips and Dip. We talked a little bit about Harden and the Russ fit. We're going to talk a little bit about the regular season. Ty Lue made some comments on All the Smoke about how he'd like people to take it more seriously. There have been comments from fans throughout the offseason about how they'd like to see younger guys utilized. But let's start out talking about something that is going to become very pertinent, which is the contract extensions for both Kawhi and Paul George. I believe Kawhi is eligible right now. Paul George will be eligible shortly. And basically, from what I've heard, and Joey, correct me if you've heard anything else, there has not been a lot of movements so far as anything serious in the way of offering, extra years. We have seen Kawhi in the past kind of let it ride on an extension. I'm not sure if that would be the same approach here, but by all indications, it seems like the front office's pitch or their intention would be to try and get these guys to maybe come for, what we've been calling like the hometown discount, given some of the availability concerns. Where are you at with that? What would you be willing to extend these guys for? Do you think that's something that you could sell one or both of these players on? Or is it a situation where by not offering the max, you've kind of opened a Pandora's box where you could lose one or both?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think a lot of people that are in the know are saying the same thing right now. Ohm was just on ESPN with he was on the Low Post podcast. So that was on YouTube, and I was watching that. And basically what Ohm said is that, no, there hasn't been a whole lot of discussion right now. He didn't get too far into why that's the case. But he also mentioned as well that, the Clippers, of course, are potentially hopeful that they would be able to strike a deal and, for less than the 4-year max. And Ohm didn't say exactly what he thought that might be, but he floated out like maybe a 2+1 or, maybe, whatever it may be that's less than the 4-year max. It would be, what the Clippers would hope for. And again, like I said, that's very consistent with what other people are saying. Brian Windhorst said he would be shocked if either of those guys got the 4-year max. Zach Lowe, echoed similar sentiments. So you're pretty much seeing around the industry from people who would know that, one, there hasn't been a whole lot of traction with Kawhi, who is currently eligible right now, and two, the Clippers are probably hopeful that they wouldn't have to extend those guys to 4-year max extensions. And I honestly think it's going to be less about like the hometown discount thing than it would be just about like what the market for those guys would be outside of the Clippers right now. Because when the Paul George Knicks rumors were kind of popping up, where you saw like, maybe the Knicks would be interested in trading for PG, like we saw some reports that, the Clippers were fielding, like not necessarily fielding calls, but were open to listening on PG. One of the reports, or one of the consistencies in all of the reports that continue to pop up, was that the Knicks and even the Trailblazers at that time, when we were thinking like babies are going to be a scoot for a PG swap, they were hesitant to do it because they didn't want to extend him to the max extension that he was reportedly seeking. So when you look at that and you say, okay, maybe a team like the Knicks wouldn't be interested in doing it, team like Portland, you probably start to think that like league wide, there probably aren't going to be a lot of teams that would just max these guys. One, because there aren't a lot of teams that even have the ability to do that. But for the teams that can, it makes sense why they would have that hesitancy. And it's nothing against what those two guys are capable of doing when on the court, but it's just the fact that they haven't been on the court enough to justify that. So I think that's a bit of leverage that the Clippers have. I don't think it's going to be as much of a situation. This is just my opinion, but I don't think it's going to be as much of a situation where they're trying to sell those guys on, a hometown discount. We got the new arena coming up. Like we could still win, all that. Like all that is great and all that, is true, but I don't think that's really going to be what it's going to take. When you get into these negotiations, the leverage that players often have is what other teams are willing to pay for them. So if there aren't a whole lot of teams outside of the Clippers that are going to say, hey, like, yeah, we would love to give you, the 4-year max, and the Clippers can say, hey, here's what we understand to be your value, and here's what we're continuing to build here, and here's the offer. So I haven't heard anything much different than that. It's obviously what's been said publicly already by guys like Ohm, who would know, and by guys like Windhorst, who would know. So I think that's where we're at right now. In terms of my opinion on that, I think it's probably pretty much the same as everybody else. I don't think you can just blindly offer those two guys 4-year max contracts right now.
Yeah.
You can't do it, right? Like it's just you can't do it. And I understand the dilemma where you're entering a new arena next year and you don't want to, enter a new arena with a rebuilding team. But at the same time, I think this actually kind of goes back to a point I made earlier when you're talking about why would you make a trade for James Harden? Well, I mean, where you're sitting right now organizationally with this era, you got Kawhi and PG both, capable of coming off the books next year. Russ can come off the books next year. What's another one? You know what I mean? What's another guy like Harden at that point that has the ability to come off the books? I mentioned that as a potential concern on my last podcast, throwing another guy like that into the mix. But what I ultimately determined was that, where you're at right now, you're going to have to figure this out anyways. So why not go for it in this final year and then, stumble into those contract situations next summer when they actually are able to opt out.
So one thing I would say about extending these guys is under this new CBA, it looks like the cap could and likely with all of these like second apron implications and everything could raise by as much as 10% every single year. So on the flip side, and I'm not advocating this because obviously availability is a concern, obviously market value is a concern, but if you were to lock those guys into a number set to the current cap as it is right now, you could end up that could end up looking like more of a value deal, say 3-4 years from now. Chuck, I'm curious about your thoughts. Is there any way that would be something you would be interested in, knowing that those two guys are going to be here, and assuming that there could be, I mean, if the cap increases by 30% over the next
from the year they
seasons,
sign it,
that contract is all of a sudden it's not looking so bad.
Man, the cap rising thing is an interesting point. And if we knew that it was going to go up to 30%, then I would say I would definitely strongly consider that. It seems like the CBA opened up for some new investments and things like that. So it seems like, I don't know, that could maybe help it. But when you put it that way, I think I'd still maybe offer Kawhi the max versus both of them the full max. Yeah, but no, I'm just trying to think of the cap figures because I'm trying to figure out if they could then sign another max guy because ideally, they would never be bad enough to bottom out, right? If that happened. So they'd be kind of not stuck because it would be a tradable contract if the cap was 30%. Yeah, I say do it. I don't know. If we know the cap's going to be up 30% from when they sign that contract,
I mean,
give
we
Kawhi
don't
the full
know
max,
that.
maybe PG
Yeah.
close to it. I don't know.
I mean, I think you got to play hardball with them because of the injury issues, and when they're
You're writing the
35
figure
and
down and
36,
sliding it across the table.
yeah, put it on the napkin, slide it across the dinner table. But ultimately, you got to bring them back at least for this season, probably the next couple if we're talking about the Intuit Dome and the attraction of having a major star there. But the other side of that is, I've seen people say this, if the availability isn't there from them, what does it matter if you have that star on the roster? Like, people aren't going to be coming to the game if they always know somebody's not going to be available or they're going to be missing 30 of the games per season. And that's pretty much what we have seen so far with these two guys, unfortunately. The payoff of the load management stuff. And while, of course, Coach Lou is right when he talks about they're not load managing in the playoffs, we're trying to win them. These are legitimate injuries. But when they had missed games in the regular season, it's become such an issue with the fan base that they're a little bit turned off by that. And if you're not getting the payoff of them winning the championships in the end, and you're seeing them get to the pot of gold, the end of the rainbow, that's where it becomes problematic. But they could win it this season, and that gives you a ton more equity because it's proof that this team was constructed the right way. It's just been a lot of bad luck that's been going on.
Well,
Were you gonna say
we've
what?
talked about it. We've talked about a lot on this podcast about how, the stadium is a factor, right? Like building the Intuit Dome, you can't afford a rebuild. But I think at the same time, my question would be, let's say things end similarly this year as they have for every year during the Kawhi Paul George era. Are we really that convinced that at that point Kawhi and Paul George are the draws for audiences that maybe we herald them as right now? Because I'm not so convinced that, that happens for the fifth year, that you're really selling out seats at at a much higher ticket price for these season ticket holders if that's the draw.
Right. If it happens again this season, I don't know how people can talk about it. Well, they have to hold on to these guys because they're getting a new arena. If the guys can't play on the court in that new arena, what does it matter
Yeah.
ultimately? If this era is just going to be defined from disappointment because of injuries, that's disastrous, obviously. And that's how it's gone so far, unfortunately. Joey, I don't know if you feel in a similar fashion. Because I know you followed this team forever. But last season, I would say, relative to expectations, may have been the most disappointing season in the history of the franchise.
It probably was, and I think I tweeted about it quite a bit throughout the course of the year, and I scaled it back towards the end of the year because, honestly, I just felt like, I was just hitting on so many of the same talking points, and I think too you do kind of start to feel for the guys who aren't able to play because, like Ty Lue continues to say, this isn't a situation where they are purposely sitting out. I do think there were a few games last year where you kind of look at it, it's like, all right, that one didn't make a whole lot of
The
sense.
Memphis
Like
game,
when,
yeah.
I was going to bring up the Memphis
Yeah.
game, then I was also going to bring up the Denver blowout when they didn't, they
Right.
played 15 minutes in the first half, didn't play the second half, and then
game in
didn't play the next
Cleveland.
game. Right. And so I think there were a few instances where you look at it and it was like, all right, you can have a gripe with that, but that's a game here and a game there. If that's all we're having this conversation, right? The reason why we're having this conversation is because they both missed significant time with injuries. So I think when you continue to harp on it, it does become a little bit tough for that reason. But back to Adam's point, part of the thing, the conversations that I was having quite a bit last year was you looked at where the Clippers were record wise, and you looked at where they were record wise against good teams, like the teams that they were going to have to beat eventually if they did want to become the championship team that they hoped to be. At no point last season did they look like a legitimate championship contender. And people
Totally.
argue that stretch with Terrence as the starting point guard, that was the stretch where they were starting to look like a championship contender. I've pushed back against that pretty strongly because
It was a
one,
good stretch, but it
was a
wasn't
good
like
stretch.
Till you look
But
at the
over the
context of how they
mountain.
won some of those games, they got lucky at the end of a bunch of them.
Quite a few of them. You had the Nico bailout 3 in New York. They completely blew that game, and he
Oh,
hit
yeah.
that 3 to tie it. They had the game in Brooklyn that they completely blew, where Nico saved that ball out of bounds, ended up getting the and one. That was the game where Brooklyn didn't have KD, Kyrie. Like, there were those types of games that they didn't deserve to win, and they won. And I get it. The goal is to win. So, yes, they won the game. But one, they weren't playing great opponents during that stretch. And two, a lot of the wins that they had, the same problems that had persisted all season, the blown leads at the end, the rotations that didn't make sense, all of those things were still there, but they snuck a few wins during that stretch. So I completely push back against the idea that they looked like a championship team during that stretch of games. Is that the best stretch of games that they had last season? Perhaps, but did they look like a championship contender? In my opinion, absolutely not. So when you're talking about the level that they need to be at in order to win a title, we didn't see that for any sustained stretch last season, which is why I think you can make the argument that it was the most disappointing season of the 2-1-3 era because of all of the hype that they had in the offseason, right? Like they, supposedly addressed some of the issues that, they had the year prior. And it's tough to even say that because like the years prior, what did it even really look like? Kawhi and PG were both out almost the entire season in 2022. So it's tough, but there was a lot of high expectations coming into that year. You were like, okay, this is the Clippers team that made the play-in pretty much without Kawhi and PG entirely. Now they're putting them back into the mix. They're adding John. They're adding, whoever else. And it was one of those things where people thought they actually might have a chance, and then it just never came to fruition. And it was mixed in with just so much frustration that I think fans are really starting to think like, okay, this might just be time to chalk it up on this era. But for some of the reasons we've discussed, they obviously haven't made that decision yet. And I think they're just so far into it, especially with re-signing Russ. You don't re-sign a guy like that to go and then trade Kawhi and PG. Like they obviously re-signed him with the expectation that those two guys would be on the roster and they would continue building around them. So I think it brings me right back to my Harden point. You just got to go for it this year and deal with whatever comes after it because you're so far into it by now and it's so ugly already that you have to just continue to do what you can at this point. And if a player like James Harden, who would normally never be available for what he could potentially be available for, is actually there and nobody else is really trying to get him, then hey, go for it and see what happens. And then after that, entering the Intuit Dome, you can let the professionals make the decisions that they need to make.
And so I don't want to push back too much on the Harden availability thing. Obviously, we've talked about it a bunch here. Makes a lot of sense for the Clippers. One team that it really doesn't make any sense for is his current incumbent team. And I think that like part of it is we have nothing that's of the value to offer. And I understand 100% that Harden's value is not at the level of a Dame or obviously, Kevin Durant or what we've seen for other players. We know that he wants to play for this certain team. But if you're Philadelphia, there's one guy on the roster who's far more important than James Harden. And I don't see any situation currently, unless you somehow work out a 3-teamer with Portland or something, where you can get a good enough player to keep Joel Embiid happy. And I think if you look historically at the NBA, so essentially for what the Clippers have to offer, the Sixers would need to be in a position where they're essentially ready for a rebuild, right? And I think if you look historically at the NBA and you look at teams that have traded a player after an MVP season, and I mean directly after it, I can only find 2. And you have to go back to the Wilt Chamberlain trade and Moses Malone. And those were also very situational things where it was very different. I understand the Harden trade for the Clippers. I would love it. I think that it's truly the best move for them. I don't really understand it for the other side. And I think that it makes sense that I understand that Terrence is a sticking point for fans and stuff. But if I'm Philadelphia and I'm staring down an offer that's centered around Norm, Terrence, maybe a first, and some salary filler, I'm saying like
Yeah.
that's the Godfather offer, right? That's the Godfather offer for the Clippers. That is all that we can give you. We cannot offer you anything else.
I think literally, yeah.
And I'm looking at
Well, that's why I said
like,
earlier.
yeah,
go
I mean,
for
but
it.
if I'm looking at that, I'm saying am I ready to trade am I ready to trade Joel Embiid? Like is that a good enough contender in the East to keep an MVP who after another second round exit, no matter what you do, might be gone? Like, is that enough? And I think, if I'm Daryl Morey, I'm probably hanging up the phone on that offer.
Absolutely. And that's why I said earlier, that's why we don't
Yeah.
have a deal
Oh,
yet. Because it's not, 100%. That's why I kind of broke down where we are and said that's why I don't think we have a deal and why I don't think we're anywhere close to a deal, because what the Clippers are offering right now, but even their best offer, kind of like what you brought up, is not consistent with the type of package you would normally see sent out for a player like James Harden.
And we've heard
But I
Maxey is
do think
unavailable
that
too, because that could be another avenue, right? Like they do a deal with the Clippers, they get rid of Harden, maybe they're willing to move off of Maxey. But like from what Windhorst was saying, he's completely unavailable. So it's just it seems very puzzling to look if you're looking at it from the Sixers perspective.
It could.
Oh, it 100% is. And I think that that's why this is just such a unique situation, because I don't think we've ever seen a player of Harden's caliber, even at this stage of his career, be valued this low around the league. And I don't think it's as much to do with what he's capable of, but just his current situation. We've seen what an unhappy James Harden can look like. And if you're a team acquiring him in a contract year where he can walk in the offseason, I think that that's why we're even having a conversation that the Clippers have the ability to potentially acquire a player like him. So, yeah, I completely understand where you're coming from. And like I said earlier, that's why point blank we don't have any real new traction on a deal, because the 76ers are not in a position to take on what the Clippers are currently offering, or potentially what their best offer would even be, because of where they are as an organization. They have to continue to maintain that championship window with an MVP like Joel Embiid. You can't just take expiring deals and some future picks back for a player like James Harden. You just can't do it, because you have to maintain your championship window. And that's where we get to our staring contest. I think we're going to end up at a fork in the road where we're getting towards training camp, and the Clippers want to get James Harden in the mix. The Philadelphia 76ers know that he doesn't want to be there, but they also feel as if organizationally they can't afford to accept what's being offered, and something's going to have to give. I can't predict right now what that's going to be, but that's where we're headed. And the point that you bring up is the reason why, because if it were a situation where the Clippers had, one, something they were willing to offer, and two, something that the 76ers were willing to accept, we'd have a deal already, and we'd be talking about what James Harden is going to look like in a Clippers uniform. But that's not where we're at. So for the points that you brought up, we're heading towards a very unique, perhaps unprecedented type of staring contest, where we're looking at a player that wants one team and one team only, but that team understands they aren't also in a position to give up one of their best assets in Terrence, because you look around this roster right now, what type of roster construction are we even talking about if you can't rely on a guy like Terrence? Obviously, we know Ty doesn't play him as much as he should, but a guy like that to play big rotational minutes. With the other guys that would potentially still be left on the roster, do we believe, even with James Harden, that is a championship contending team, with some of these guys maybe having to play more minutes than they already did last season? So yeah, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to this particular James Harden situation, and I don't think anybody can predict 100% what it's going to look like, because it's pretty unique. We haven't seen anything quite like
the other
this.
layer to all of this is now the NBA is trying to put the kibosh on stars wanting out and wanting to go to one team and one team only, with the release they made regarding Damian Lillard. So it's going to be an exceptionally challenging time.
I hope they're
Philly.
declining every call from Harden's agent. We don't want any leaks of what the agent is
anything
telling
to do with
him.
that. You know what's funny?
We
I
don't
actually
want
wrote about
anything to
that
do
the
with
other
that.
day. Dude, I literally wrote about that the other day, because everyone was talking about Lillard when this came out, and rightfully so. It was directed at him. But I think it was a very unique situation for Harden and the Clippers, because what it did was, and who knows what the punishment's going to be, right? Like, it could be, the type of slap on a wrist where it's like a player doesn't really care. But let's just, for the sake of the argument, pretend that it's something that would actually deter, a player like Harden from, engaging in the type of behavior that the league's trying to stop. He just lost a little bit of, his power play, right? Like if he's able to come out eventually and say, hey, I'm not going to suit up for the Knicks if they trade for me, or I'm not going to suit up for this team if they trade for me. They basically shut that down in that memo. So it's also something to consider.
It could just be baked in anyways because it's James Harden and people know how he tends to go about these things. But to transition away from Philly, who could be in a transitional phase over the next year, I could see them just waiting for Tobias to come off the books and sell Joel Embiid on, hey, we're going to bring somebody else in. But that's tough. He's in his prime. But going back to the regular season talk that we had, we played the audio somewhat.
You played the audio from your phone.
From my phone into the microphone of Coach Lou on the All the Smoke pod. In a very unprofessional manner, we played it here. But a lot of people, I'm just going to throw this out there to everybody, but a lot of people immediately afterwards, hearing his comments talking about taking the regular season more serious and him directing that at Kawhi and Paul George, felt some kind of way about Coach Lou saying that when there was a lot of experimenting last season. Openly, post-game, he would talk about it. And some of it's very understandable because of the transition with the roster and bringing in new guys all the time, and then Russ, but they did ask for that. How did you guys feel about Coach Lou saying that, I guess, coming from him, where a lot of people did early in the season point the finger and say, well, you're kind of lending the regular season to some of these losses because there's so much fiddling, as we talked about it, the fiddler. I think we said that about Coach Lou early in the season.
I don't think it was fiddler.
I love fiddler though.
Yeah, fiddler. Yeah.
We love Coach Lou, but obviously it was happening during the regular season. So how do they go about taking the regular season more seriously when it's not just their two superstars, but also Coach Lou, who wants to try things out in the regular season?
Yeah, so I actually saw it a little bit differently than some of the people who were talking about the, too much tinkering, too much trying, this or that. I think it was kind of the opposite. I don't think there was enough trying new things. We saw Marcus continue to start well beyond, the amount of games that he should have.
We'll talk about Marcus, in a few. Yeah.
We never saw the all-wing lineup that was kind of touted in training camp. There were some things that we just didn't see that we thought we were going to see. Like they stuck with the 3-guard lineups way too long. So I think it was more a lack of tinkering and adjustments than, trying too many things. I get we had different moving pieces with, John and them being in and then out and then Russ being in. So I get that was part of it. But when you're just talking about it straight from an adjustment standpoint, part of why people coming into the season were confident in the roster that they had, even without a backup center at the time, was because of Ty Lue's ability to kind of experiment and find what works. We didn't really see that as much as we thought we were going to. We saw a lot of sticking with what wasn't working, whether that be 3-guard groups or whether that be, Marcus or whatever it may be. I think we kind of saw a lack of tinkering, kind of putting my fingers in quotes, what it was that, we hoped to see. But to the point of his comments about taking the regular season more seriously, my question is, well, what exactly does that look like? Because if we're having the conversation about load management and saying that, well, load management wasn't exactly what was occurring last year. It was more so like when you're talking about on a wide scale, the missed games were actual injuries. Yeah. Then what are we exactly referring to?
I prefer load management.
Right. It's like, what are we exactly talking about when we say we need to take the regular season more seriously? I don't think we have like a direct answer of what he was even kind of suggesting. And honestly, that's something that I don't mind asking, like, at media day even, or whenever we talk to Ty next, it's like, it's not in a way to try to trick him or challenge him. Like, this is an honest question. When you talk about what, taking the regular season more seriously and what that looks like, what exactly are you suggesting? Because obviously Ty isn't the type of guy that is just, of the belief that Kawhi and PG were just sitting out because they felt like sitting out. One, that's not what was occurring. And two, that's certainly not something that he felt. So when you talk about taking the regular season more seriously, I still don't think we 100% know what he was referring to. I kind of believe perhaps it was just the overall intensity level, because Ty has talked a lot about how much that changed once Russ showed up, right? Like they went harder in practices, they went harder in games, like just their overall focus level was better. So perhaps he's talking about just having that from day one. But again, Adam, I want to make sure I hit on the point that you brought up about fans being upset about that message coming from him when there was just a lot of questionable to be nice about it, decisions that were made on his part. I get it. I completely get it. And I don't think that you need me to tell you that right now for you to know that I get it. Like, I feel like I was pretty consistent last year with pointing out the things that didn't make sense. So I understand the frustration. I definitely know where it's coming from, because there were quite a few things last year that just flat out didn't make sense. I think you can make the argument that even with the injuries that the Clippers dealt with, and even with the very conservative approach to Kawhi Leonard and Paul George's workload, if they would have had a more locked in approach to, one, just the season in general, but also two, if Ty would have been more intentional about, maybe pivoting away from some of these things that so clearly weren't working, the Clippers would have been in a better spot last season than they were when the season ended, even with the injury situation. So there's a lot of that to break down when you talk about taking the regular season more seriously. It's a lot more nuanced than just saying Kawhi and PG need to play more. Clearly.
No, and I think you touched upon it. It is just a lack of intensity, quarter to quarter, possession to possession, game to game at times with these guys, where we saw it when they flipped that switch against the Memphis Grizzlies when they were down 17 or whatever it was coming into that fourth quarter.
After what, 51-point third quarter?
After just getting lit up by a Memphis team without Ja, and they just knew they had to win that game, and they did. And you could see there was a different level of energy out there. And I do think he was trying to figure out a way, a lot of mouths to feed with all the guards to start off the season, to make it work where everybody was getting minutes. And that's not an easy job. So it was kind of like he was tinkering in all the ways that people didn't want him to when you just wanted to see Wingstop, and we were having those expectations coming into the season. It never came to fruition.
And it was the 10-game sample size too, I think, from Ty Lue that kind of like, it is the right amount of games to figure out if things work. But when you're only doing kind of, like you said, kind of maybe different areas that should be fixed for 10 games, it gets
well. What's interesting is that last year he actually, I don't know if this even got tweeted out a whole lot, but he actually said that he was increasing his usual 10-game sample size to even more than that because of how many new moving pieces they had, and partially because Kawhi started the season, played 2 games off the bench, and then we didn't see him for a long time. So he was actually asked that question at the beginning of last year. And again, I don't know really if it got tweeted out or if it got tweeted out a whole lot, but I do remember him saying that he was actually going to increase that window of 10 games to, he didn't give like a number of it, but he's like, it's going to be more because we just have to see some longer. But it got to a point where it's like, you also got to start winning games, and you also have to start putting your best product out there on the floor. It's an 82-game season. This isn't baseball where you're playing 162 games and you have more time to figure some of these things out. Like, especially with the Clippers not having their best guys available all the time, their margin for error wasn't that large. So last year, they couldn't afford to play with some of these things, I think, as long as they did, which is where some of the frustration was setting in with the fan base, where it's like, okay, clearly this isn't working. And there were some of the things that were like very glaring, right? Like when you just talk about, the Reggie minutes and even the John minutes early on, and those guys with other guards that just, even if you never saw them together, you would probably be able to predict that it wouldn't work. There was just so many of those things that even if his sample size, and again, I'll give him that because he was open about that, even if it was, planned to be increased because of so many moving parts that the Clippers had going on, it got to a point last year where it's like, okay, you can't just continue to run with this because it's so clearly not working and we're falling down the standings. And now, 2 weeks left in the season, we actually have to keep ourselves out of the play-in. So he alluded to that on All the Smoke, and we'll see what it looks like next year. We'll see what it looks like in terms of, him and the team in general taking the regular season more seriously.
It's tough when you got to get guys to buy in and give them that opportunity to fail, which could be 10 games or however many games that were promised. Even though everybody's seeing it the same way, it's tough to go back on that if you already told somebody, hey, we're going to give you this amount of time and see what it looks like. I'm sure it's just not easy being a coach in this league, obviously.
Counterpoint, Incredibly easy. That's why so many coaches have championships. All right, coming up, we got to talk about some random stuff. There was some weird drama about DeAndre Jordan's old number, as well as Marcus Morris is on Threads. For those of you who are on Threads and want a new follow. But first, we got ads coming up. They've been a little loud for some people. So if that's been your case, go ahead and turn it down. We got ads coming up in 3, 2, 1. All right, we are back with random stuff. KJ Martin is going to wear DeAndre Jordan's old number. Is this weird? I've been going back and forth in my head if this is weird or something that I'm just thinking about because it's the off season and there's a horrific heat wave ripping through my apartment without central AC. But Adam, Will, Joey, is this weird? Will, we'll start with you. Weird, not weird. It's like our version of haggle, no haggle, but much less refined.
I don't think it's that weird. I'm sorry.
Not weird. All right.
I don't think it's that weird. Look, I love DeAndre. Always will. One of the funnest eras of Clippers basketball. Most fun. But the way, I got to be honest, man, the way that his tenure ended here kind of left me with a bad taste in my mouth. Also, like, how do you determine what number is off limits? You know, like I as you know, proud as I am of like how they were able to develop DeAndre, the incredible rebounder that he was. Truly, like I like if that's the caliber
You're saying
of player,
what's the BFD?
like that. Well, not to be rude, but like if that's the caliber of player that the number is off limits, then what number do you choose?
I mean, he's the all-time leader in games played for them, rebounds, field goal percentage. But I get it too. I could see it either way. I mean, did KJ Martin, was he a fan growing up here in SoCal?
I'll research right now.
Was that his guy? Because if he wants to board like DeAndre Jordan, I'm fine with that. And if wearing his number inspires him, I'm good. Joey?
Yeah, so I don't think, again, we don't know if this is a situation where DJ really cares or like, because I mean, this is obviously
that's a great point too.
Sport,
yeah.
But
did he post a thread today? Are we sure that he didn't post a thread about this?
It's like the Angels just gave Randall Grichuk Tim Salmon's number 15.
Oh, that's kind of insane.
He's the first. He's the first player to wear it since. But Tim Salmon actually went on the record and said like he's completely fine with it. Didn't have an issue with it. So it's like we don't know how the players themselves feel about it, right? So like there could have very well been a conversation between DJ and KJ Martin where they talked about it. And DJ's like, dude, wear my number. You know what I mean? So like we don't really know that. In terms of how I feel about it personally, I think the only thing that kind of caught me off guard a little bit is that I don't know if you guys remember 2 seasons ago when incorrectly Wenyen Gabriel was listed on the roster with Blake's 32. I don't know if you guys remember that. But it was when we had him for, what was it, a 10-day or whatever?
Yeah, that game against Brooklyn.
Man, maybe put his jersey in the rafters for that.
No one touched that number. No one.
Yeah. But actually, initially, Wenyen was listed on the official Clippers roster on NBA.com with number 32. So people, myself,
you were losing your damn mind. Yeah,
you know how I feel about that. So I was like, man, what's going on with that?
He's got a Kia commercial now. It's crazy.
Yeah. Right. Adam, you probably know Max Reza, right? Works for the Clippers, and I just looked at his Twitter bio. He's the director of team operations.
Great, yeah.
When that was all going down, he cleared it up and he said, no, Gabriel is not 32. He's actually 35. He said, we hold 32 off limits. So this wasn't, I just put it up on my phone. This was January 1st of 2022. And he got a response on Twitter, and a fan asked him, which other numbers do you guys hold off limits? And he said 3, 6, and 32. They started the culture here. It's only right to block those off. So I actually had a couple people send me that yesterday because I was part of that thread. Because I was one of the people who was like, wait a minute, why does Wenyen Gabriel have Blake's 32? So I was actually tagged in that thread. So a couple people sent me that yesterday. They're like, wait, what's going on? Why does KJ have number 6 when Max said that they were holding it off? So again, I don't know what went into that.
It was his number in Houston too, because the other part is that it was his number before the league officially retired 6 for Bill Russell.
Right.
So he can keep it as long as he doesn't change it. So I wonder if DeAndre
for that reason,
keep your number.
So
like,
DJ
there's a good
also
chance,
is
man. I
still an
think at some
active
point-
player, so it's not like he's a
Yeah, that's
retired player
true.
and they're
Yeah.
getting ready to do a ceremony for him at Intuit
Yeah.
Dome or
He's
something.
still playing. Yeah.
Right, and I think it would be different if he had 32, right? Like
For sure.
as
Oh,
great
absolutely.
as DJ
Yeah.
was, and I'm very fond of DJ and what he meant to the Clippers during that era, and I do think he should have his jersey retired at the Intuit Dome. But it would be different if it was 32. So I think for that reason, there could have been a conversation. I think we'll probably eventually find that out, right? I think DJ's a pretty chill guy. I don't think he's the type of guy that would really have that big of an issue with it. So in terms of it being an actual issue, no, I don't think it's an actual issue. I just think that there was some confusion because of, well, like I said, it had been at least somewhat kind of publicly stated that 6 was being held off limits with 3 and 32. So that's where some people were like, wait, what's going on with that? But again, we don't know exactly what's going on. It could just be a situation where DJ's like, man, where my number? It's not.
Isn't the real
Retire
question?
the chair. Retire the chair.
Yeah, retire the
from
chair that
from
was
his
on the
re-sign
door.
What
situation,
number was
obviously.
what was Brandon Knight wearing when DeAndre Jordan dunked on him? What number did he have?
Mine says 11.
Something
Retire
weird.
that.
A weird number. Yeah. All right, and we got to talk about the Marcus Morris thread. That was a thing on Twitter, and now it's what Instagram calls their version of Twitter that's lost half of its user base, but not Marcus Morris. He is still on Threads, for better or for worse. He threaded something to the effect of, "Wish I had my Twitter, bum ass Clippers fans, LOL." I think there was a Z, and maybe it was bum ass. Maybe the Clippers had a Z. I don't know.
I thought Threads was a nice, friendly place. I thought that was how they were distinguishing themselves from Twitter.
I'm going to say this before. I think I totally get where Marcus Morris is coming from, because Clippers Twitter, people were creating specific accounts to horribly troll this man who was never supposed to be the number one option on the Clippers team. I think sometimes people think maybe he had some kind of power over Ty Lue where he was like, I'm going to play. I don't think that's what happened. I can see him not wanting to be on Twitter at all because of how a small percentage, very small percentage of Clippers Twitter in particular kind of went at Marcus Morris during this year. It just got mean. It just got mean. Adam, go ahead.
No, mean, inappropriate, over the line. Also, is he supposed to not start if he's in the starting lineup and give up his spot like Vince Carter in the All-Star game for MJ or something? Like, if the coach wants to put him out there, he's going to start. We know, especially the last half of the season, Marcus did not perform like he had previously with the Clippers. But this is somebody who hit big shots in the playoffs, obviously against Dallas with the 7 3-pointers, played big when Kawhi went down, especially against Phoenix in a couple of games in the Western Conference Finals. Like, the incoming got a little bit uncomfortable, I think, for everybody who was
they were
not
using
trolling.
AI to make weird stuff about him. It was
the pictures of like his wife and saying like, Marcus, time to come home, time to retire and stuff.
Weird.
Like, it was over the line. It crossed the line. I think it took the fandom. I know people are just doing it for clout and retweets and likes a lot of the time, and they're not that serious about it. But it was unbecoming of Clipper Nation, I would say.
Unbecoming. Joey,
A very small minority of Clipper Nation.
Do you have a stronger word than unbecoming to use?
Well, it's funny. People might not believe this about me because obviously I do, tweet frequently. But this offseason in particular, I've been trying to stay off of Twitter as much as possible because during last season, after my first full season on the beat, like I was just exhausted mentally. I was just drained. It was an exhausting year. So I don't know what's developed this summer a whole lot in terms of like how people are coming at Marcus. But I did see some of the stuff during the season. I mean, some of it was in my replies. I would post the starting lineup and it would be in my replies. So like, yes, I've seen quite a bit of it. Absolutely, the stuff that Adam mentioned is too far, should never happen. It's the same stuff that we would call out the Lakers fan base for doing, right? Like there's certain things that you just should never say, certain lines you should never cross. So if that's what he's referring to, and if it's a situation where like he's seen some of that, I don't know what he's seen or what he hasn't seen, then of course you're going to have an issue with that. It was just very shocking to kind of see him call out the fan base directly like that.
The timing is interesting
again,
too.
I'm not going to sit here and Right, because
I'm like, yeah,
obviously,
okay.
he was already kind of traded this offseason, and he would definitely be a player who would be
Right.
included in one of these trades. So yeah, like obviously all that's at play. I don't know what he's seen, what specifically he was responding to, so I'm not going to pretend to know.
For sure.
But yes, I've seen the stuff that has crossed the line, and I don't think it takes somebody with like some super high like moral compass to say like, yeah, that shouldn't happen. Like obviously there's certain things that shouldn't be said, and there has been some of that, and I don't think I've seen all of it, but I've seen some of it. So yeah, it's kind of just where I'll leave that.
Will, counterpoint. Now you argue the other side of this argument.
Drag him further. You know what, Marcus Morris? You think it's tough here? Wait till you're in Philly, buddy.
Just the word.
He's from there, right?
Yeah, I think he would do great in Philly.
But the situation is probably untenable, not just because he was almost traded, but now this. Like I have a hard time seeing Marcus Morris being in the roster opening night. From both
I don't know how you do that.
sides, it just
Yeah.
seems like a situation where he will be moved, regardless of if we're talking about James Harden or not.
I think
Yeah, and
not.
I mean, I want to
Right.
be clear too, like going back on what I was saying, I don't want to come across as if I'm like bashing Clippers fans for being upset with the way
course,
he played,
totally.
because like that's not where I'm at either. Like I'm just strictly talking about, like you said, making accounts of his wife and stuff like that. Like let's be serious. Like let's not do that. There's stuff that I did see a little bit of that is like, all right, yeah, we obviously shouldn't do that. But also want to be clear too, like I completely understand where some of the frustration is coming from
Yeah.
Clippers fans, because it's beyond
Totally.
just his poor play as well. Like we had the report from Andrew where he was like upset with his role, and I think too, like there's Clippers fans who observed body language, observed different things that they saw. Where like Rocco was a guy who was out of the rotation all season long last year. A lot of people felt wrongfully so, and you watch him on the bench, and like every single game he's up, every single game he's cheering,
He's
like
throwing
every single
t-shirts.
game he's engaged,
He's
like.
sacrificed.
So
Yeah,
I
no
think
shit.
fans see that and they say that's how a player who, in their opinion, and I think rightfully, hold that opinion, should have been playing, who was the ultimate teammate. Whereas now, like we're getting reports where Marcus got much longer of a leash than he should have, and we get that report from Andrew where he was still unhappy. So I think that's where some of the frustration stems from the fan base. In no way would I ever say that warrants making an account of his wife and
Of
taking to that
course.
extent. That's ridiculous. But when you're just talking about the overall sense that the fan base had towards him, and then now him like saying bum ass Clippers fans, I get where that kind of riff is. So yeah, that's where I'll leave that.
Criticizing someone's play, I think, is always fair game. You're a paying customer. You want to see guys play better. I don't know if it's always helpful. I don't know if booing a guy. I remember when Baez was taking a ton of incoming from Dodgers fans all the time. I don't know if that helps a guy with his confidence, but it's your right to do so. I don't agree with taking it too far, and that's what it got to eventually. But I brought up his play, and I was taking calls every night, and I think half the calls I got last season, somebody had something to say about Marcus Morris.
You were short with callers. You were upset with callers last season.
I mean, it just got to the point where, look, I can't explain it either why he's still starting. When I'm watching that game, a critical game against the Pelicans late in the season, the home game for the Clippers, and I think there were 18 points scored on him in the first quarter, and it was tough to watch. They were trying to hide him. It wasn't working. But again, that's Marcus is a paid player to be out there. It's not his fault. He's not going to bench himself. But yeah, a lot of stuff crossed the line, obviously.
For sure. Well, we are about to wrap this up. This has been a wonderful episode. Joey, you need to promote. What do you got coming up? Where can these wonderful people find you if for some reason they're not already following your Clippers content? You have minimum 15 minutes to promote yourself. No, I'm just kidding. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so to be quite honest with you, I have not been as consistent with my podcast this summer as much as I would like to, because I really have just been trying to step away. Listen, man, I'm being honest when I say last season took a lot out of me. It was
that's
it was
the consensus of pretty much every reporter.
It was a grind, man, and I am so blessed and thankful to have the opportunity that I have to be able to work the job that I work. So I want to make that clear that I'm not complaining. But when last season ended, like I needed to take a break just from talking about basketball in general. So I've only really least a few podcast episodes, but I do have my club that I will sporadically be, having episodes up throughout the summer. Once the season starts, I'm going to get right back into it. I'm honestly thinking about maybe kind of like rebranding my Clips Combos Instagram and making it just more so like my own personal, like,
Reporting.
NBA work stuff where I post my videos and like stuff like that. So I might do that, towards the beginning of the season. But in terms of where I'm most active, obviously Twitter, Joey Lynn _ is where I'll probably be tweeting, once or, twice or 3 times a week, maybe, whatever I'm doing this summer. I'm not all that active, but you guys know that during the season, I'll be tweeting about all the relevant stuff that needs to be talked about. So yeah, that's where you can find me on Twitter, Joey Lynn _ and then obviously my pod combos, Joe, if you want to peek in every week or 2 weeks, there might be a new episode there, but that's where we're at right now.
Well, we appreciate you stopping by. It's been fantastic. We hope the rest of your off season is relaxing and the Twitter break is good for you. We should probably all take a break from Twitter. Will, where can people find this podcast and video of this podcast if they haven't seen it?
You could check this podcast out over on iTunes or Spotify. If you left a rating or review for us on either one of those platforms, it'd be great. You can also listen to us on Google Podcasts. We're on Stitcher. We're on Deezer. We're on Amazon Music. Anywhere you listen to podcasts, you can listen to this show. You can check out the video of this over on YouTube. That's at Clippers Podcast. And don't forget to chop it up with us over on Twitter. That's at Clippers Pod. We're still there until it burns down or whatever. So yeah, thanks for listening.
Yeah. Adam, any positive to leave the Clippers fans off with?
Yeah, I'll kind of underscore what Joey was saying. We're definitely dealing with some first world problems right now, and Clipper Nation is not used to that with a team with championship expectations. First world NBA problems. But a wise man once said, worst day in the NBA, best day anywhere else. And that man would be Brian Seaman, who I believe is going to be joining us at some point in the near future on this podcast. So we'll tease that out.
We absolutely will. We appreciate everyone. We hope you have a great rest of your week. And as always, let's go Clips.